This video is all about crew fate when a crewed unit is destroyed. Generally, crews are protected from damage as long as a unit is not destroyed. So if a hit destroys the crewed unit, you have to figure out what happens to the crew, and that's determined by a roll you've already made, which is the destroying shot of the unit, the intensity that actually took that unit out. So we're going to take a look at an example here, a couple of examples. The first one, we're going to look at two tanks firing at each other in the village street here. So we've got a Sherman tank firing at a Panther, and we'll say that the U.S. has the initiative right now, so they're going to fire first. So these declared attacks are already set, and they're going to fire their main guns because it's the only thing effective for attacking armor. So the U.S. is going to fire its Sherman's main gun. Let's see what happens here. So that's a miss. Okay, so we mark that that's done. And then the Germans are going to fire back. And the Germans need a 10. They got it. And so you roll intensity. Intensity is a 5 and a 7. Okay, so 5 is added to the damage index, which is 7. That's 12, and that is going to go to the defense of 5. That means that 7 gets through on 14. Okay, so what happens? Well, we draw a damage card. So let's pick a damage card here. And now, here's one of the examples where crews can be destroyed. And in fact, the unit as well. The damage card says internal fire, unit destroyed. Intensity roll determines crew survival. Now, what was the intensity roll? We saw that we rolled a 5 as the destroying shot from the Panther. And you look at your quick reference, a 4 to 6 means that the crew survives damaged, and they may actually fight as infantry. Now what happens here is the Sherman is gone. It's destroyed. The German player would get 14 points for that. You can see here at the top. We draw a damage card for the tank crew. And we apply the infantry effect now. So additional damage is the effect. Unit receives D10 additional damage. Since he's damaged, we're saying he's at 5. Now if I roll at least a 5, which I didn't, he would also be destroyed. So what happened here? The Sherman was hit with a shell. The Panther ignited an internal fire in the tank. The crew, however, bailed out, received some damage, but they're still technically okay. And what can happen is in a future movement phase, the U.S. player may try to move them to cover, or even try to get them to a reserve's entry point so that they can exit the map. So that's just one example of how a crew might be destroyed, or actually how a crew might survive on the map if the unit is destroyed. Now let's look at that intensity shot again. Let's say that we just outright destroyed this Sherman. So what would happen if this attack ends up destroying the Sherman outright? Okay, so let's say we rolled really well on intensity. So we rolled say a 10. 10 and a 7 is 17 minus 5 is going to be 12 points. So let's say he already had a little bit of damage, maybe from a different attack or something. So let's say he was at 8. Not quite damaged to reach a critical card draw, but enough where he's only got 8 points left. So 10 and 7, 17, minus 5 is 12 through on the 8. That destroys the Sherman. Now again, crew survival is dependent on this intensity roll. So if the German player rolled a 10, look at that chart, and the chart says 7 or higher, the crew perishes with the unit. So essentially, the higher the intensity, the more likely it is the crew is also destroyed. The lower the intensity, the more likely the crew survives, and they can either survive on the map in the space, damaged, or unharmed. If it's low enough, they're unharmed. If it's in the middle, they're basically surviving damaged. So that's basically crew survival for a frontline unit that's crewed. Now, there are some damage cards, as you saw, that can actually result in crew destruction as well. So some of them, like internal fire, that can destroy the crew, or you can even have crew casualties that limit what weapons you can use. You can have effects where the crew will abandon the crewed unit and go to the reserves deck, essentially, which leaves the unit by itself in the space. So So different things can happen with crews, and some of them are triggered by damage cards. But the majority of the time you'll be destroying a unit and then having to figure out what happens to the crew just by looking at the intensity roll you've already rolled. So there's no additional rolling. Now, how do you handle aircraft? Let's say that an aircraft is flying over the map. The simple way to handle aircraft, when they execute their flight path and say something takes them out, a flat gun, etc., you just assume that if the aircraft is destroyed, the pilot is also destroyed. That's the simplest way to do it. Now, if a rear line unit is destroyed, say this howitzer was being fired upon by some German artillery, what happens to the crew then? Well, we're not going to survive damaged on the rear line. So the simplest way to handle rear line artillery is that if the off-board artillery unit is destroyed, the crew is also destroyed, similar to aircraft. So really the times where crew survival comes into play the most is on the front line when you've got a crewed tank, a crewed frontline gun like a PaK 40 or a 57mm anti-tank gun, and cases like that. So that is crew survival and how that works in a nutshell.